Thank you so much. Very happy to be speaking here again today. Hopefully next year we'll be in person, but for the time being, we'll do the best we can working from home. And the topic of my talk today is evaluating innovative portfolios and preparing for competition. So the outcomes here today, the things I'd like for you to take away from this talk are to learn better the strategic underpinnings of the work that you're doing. You're allocating resources to various projects and what have you, but it's good to have at least broad understanding of how the industry operates and why it is that the decisions which are being made are made, and also which decisions might be made, which will impact the things you're going to have to do. So you can try and stay one step ahead. So the objectives are to understand how to anticipate generic entry and maybe even identify which generic companies or which types of generic companies may be entering and competing in your markets. Also importantly, anticipating what is called a 505(b)(2) entry, and I'll be getting into that in a little bit. There's a reason why it's called a 505(b)(2) and not anything else. Some people call them super generics, some people call them other names, and I'll be explaining why I think that the best thing to call them is just a 505(b)(2). And finally, what are some of the things that your company may be doing to accommodate generic entry? And one of them is to leverage branding in preferred sales channels so you can actually compete with generics. So we'll go through all that, and then I'll take questions afterwards. So as of course is apparent, patent expirations bring change. And one of the most striking changes is that sales revenues for brands can drop precipitously. At the same time, the units being sold might go up because there's greater access to medicines at lower prices. And so that's the trade-off, of course, for generic entry, is that brands get many years of patent protection. And once the patents expire, the markets open up, many companies can enter, and ideally consumer interests are being served in the whole process because you have a balance of innovation at the same time helping ensure that medicines are affordable. So another truism is that as more generics enter the market, prices go down. There's only a couple of really important points on the slide. The first is that when there's only one generic entrant, prices tend not to go down very much. And when there's many generic entrants, prices go down a lot. And so both sides of this chart can be troublesome for different players. When there's only one generic on the market, consumers don't really see better prices, even though there is competition. And on the flip side, when there's many generics on the market, what you find is that additional generic entrants are actually dissuaded because of the price competition. Or conversely, if it's anticipated that a lot of generics will be entering the market, then generic companies will stratify themselves and make decisions about which opportunities they want to go after based on the level of competition they see. So if there's going to be a lot of generic entrants, this is something which any company entering the market needs to think about, is what price will they be able to sell their drugs for, and how long will they be able to do that for before other companies enter. So I'm going to go over very briefly how generic companies make their market entry decisions and what indicators you and your companies will be using to track in advance of ANDA approval or generic drug approval, so you can anticipate which sorts of companies might be launching, and maybe even specifically which ones will be launching, but also, very, very importantly, when generics might be entering the market, which will affect all the life cycle decisions in managing your portfolio. So broadly speaking, there's a couple of different factors which can influence generic entry decisions. This comes from a study of how generic companies decided to enter the market. And it's not just price. It's not just, there's a high price drug out there and we can sell for 10 cents on the dollar, so let's run to that market. One of the most important factors is the ingredient. If a generic company has trusted suppliers for an ingredient, they're selling one drug and that supplier can get them the active pharmaceutical ingredient for another drug which is ready to go off market, then they know that they can trust that supplier to deliver them a consistent supply of high quality drug, and that's going to be attractive. Flipping over to the third column, the other large factor is capital costs. So we have clients who ask us for drugs which are sold in ampules between 0.5 and 0.9 mils. The reason is because they have the setup to make exactly that distribution form. So for early dose drugs, it's a broader swath, but for things like injectable drugs or any complicated dosing system, you can actually narrow down who the generic entrants might be based on who has the ability to make drugs in that form. The other factors are stuff like recipe and testing. So once you get beyond the ingredient, how is it that you're going to formulate the drug? And if a generic company has experience with those sorts of formulations, then of course opportunities in that space are going to be more attractive to them. And finally, of course, the distribution. So if a generic company already has downstream supply chain partners to whom they can sell additional drugs because it's in the right category, that makes their lives easier, and so it's going to impact favorably which drugs they decide to enter the market for. So another important aspect here is, I mentioned the stratification among generic entrants for when they want to enter the market based on the competition in the space. And what has been seen is that there's a strong generic first mover advantage. And this drives things like patent challenges or early entry. And patent challenges are very expensive, and so is early entry for a number of other reasons. And so you'll tend to find the larger generic companies will be trying to get the first mover advantage. Briefly, as noted on the slide here, the first generic entrant can enjoy an 80% market share advantage over even the second entrant, and it can last for many, many years. The reason for that is because the suppliers who are warehousing and distributing generic drugs don't really want to have to switch generic drug suppliers, because when they do that, they're going to end up having to stockpile twice as many drugs. And also, it's just the risk of switching from one supplier to another. It's if they have a reasonably priced drug from a high quality source with a good reputation and very few 483s, a low recall history, then why would you want to switch from there? It's not only price which is going to drive generic adoption. So if a high quality, strong company can establish a foothold, they're in cycle with when their downstream suppliers are going to be restocking. They already have the relationships, and so it can be seen that they'll have a strong market share advantage. So there's a strong, compelling interest. That's the bottom line. Is there's a strong, compelling interest for generics to try to be the first entrant. So the question I alluded to before, what is the earliest possible generic entry date? And briefly, for novel drugs, chemicals never before used as a drug, it's 4 years, perhaps 4.5 years, depending on some nuances, from the date of launch. There's 5 years of what's called new chemical entity exclusivity, which is offered by the FDA for new chemicals, and generics can't even try to launch less than 1 year before that. So the ANDAs, or generic approvals, won't even be accepted by the FDA until 1 year before the 5 years, which is basically 4 years since the drug was launched. So this is when you would start looking for things like patent challenges. And it's important because if you take a look at the patents on a drug, you might think that the expiration is many, many years out, but 1 year before the NCE date, 4 years after approval, is when you're going to start seeing, especially for high volume drugs, you're going to be seeing that generics will be trying to enter the market and launching litigation. So it's very important to watch this so that you can track earlier than anticipated generic entry. And so beyond looking at just that, the FDA does not disclose the names of the patent challengers, but if you take a look at tentative approvals, which is an approval but for the fact that patents still exist, that is a way to basically do an end run and find out who it is who might be the first generic entrants. And so it's worthwhile to take a look at that, see who it might be, know what their strategies are, and figure out how to adapt to these challenges. Taking a step backwards, Apixaban's a test case here because it actually had a couple of full-on approvals, not just tentative approvals, but they never launched. And so taking a look at this to try to figure out when it was that they could launch, we were looking at things like drug master files. Drug master files are sometimes filed late, and so they're not always the most informative, but without a drug master file, the drug can't launch. With a drug master file, you can find out who it is who's ready to be launching a drug. The next step, taking a step backwards from that, is the National Drug Code. Without a National Drug Code number, you cannot sell a drug. So despite the fact that Apixaban had full-on generic approvals, we were tracking for our clients NDC numbers, because until the NDC numbers were filed, there wasn't going to be a launch. And so it's a more effective way to be watching the stalemate between the brand and the generic in this case to figure out when the launch might occur. So I mentioned stratification in generic drug companies, just taking a bit of a shift here. So this first day launch or earliest possible launch where you get the 80% market share potentially for many years. But what a lot of generic companies will do is they'll elect to not have strong legal teams. They just don't want to get into the multi-million-dollar patent battles. And so what they will do is they'll wait until someone else has filed a patent challenge, succeeded in that patent challenge. The first patent challenger gets 6 months, 188 days of generic market exclusivity. And what a lot of generic companies will do is wait for day 181. So they know they're not going to be the first entrant, but at least they can get a good chunk of whatever is left behind for the later entrants. Going even further back, we have clients who what they really like is the low competition opportunities. And so they've asked us for these reports, things like off-patent drugs with no sources or with one source. And so there's no reason why in these cases, there's no generics on the market, but for the fact that no one has launched. There's nothing keeping them off the market. And so this is another place for generics to look, and they're much lower, obviously, lower value opportunities. Maybe the drugs are hard or expensive to manufacture, or maybe it's low volume, but still it's an opportunity for a company with some extra bandwidth to be pushing something down the pipeline and get into the market. So to summarize here, when you look to anticipate generic entry, you want to combine independent sources because, in many cases it's unknowable in advance when generics will enter. Even if they have approvals, they might not have launched yet. So you look at things like the NDC numbers to figure out who will be launching when. But also the volume of litigation can anticipate the number of generic entrants. So with apixaban, there was a ton of patent litigation on that drug, so you knew that there was a lot of interest. So it's another way to try to figure out if there's more likely to be earlier than anticipated generic entry. If generics are going to be entering before the patents expire, simply because there's so much litigation against the drug, it indicates a lot of interest. So what are your options when generics want to enter the market if you can't keep them off the market? The first option I list here is partnering with the first generic entrant. So Pfizer licensed sildenafil, Viagra, to Teva in advance of patent expiration. And so that's one way in which they were able to keep the rest of the generics at bay, was by basically de-incentivizing market entry. And I'll be covering authorized generics in just a little bit as well. I just want to touch briefly before I go into some of the other strategies on biologics. So at the time of this recording, the purple book which is a listing of all biologic drugs, looks to be getting patent linkages, but that's months away from happening, and it's not yet known what that will look like. So without patent linkage for biologic drugs, the best place to look for who might be a biosimilar entrant would be to look at the clinical trials for biologic drugs. We also have detailed patent information on them, but a great way to try to identify who will be trying to work around those patents or waiting for those patents to expire is to simply take a look at who's doing biosimilar clinical trials for a biologic drug. So I was mentioning some of the things which can be used defensively to keep generics at bay. And one of them is simply looking at sales channels. So for drugs like Nexium or Viagra, where there's very, very strong branding, what you see here is the striking difference is for Viagra revenue sales channels and the sildenafil citrate or generic Viagra sales channel is the yellow and dark blue bars. So you see a vast minority of Viagra revenues come from HMO clinic and hospital orders. These are controlled formularies, and the vast majority of generic Viagra is moved through exactly those channels because they're controlled formularies. When the drug is sold through mail order, the vast majority of mail order revenues go to the brand, not to the generic. And so this is just an example of strong branding, which allows Viagra to get strong sales through certain channels when the consumer has a choice. When it's through a controlled formulary, then price dictates. So I mentioned 505(b)(2)s at the very beginning. I didn't want to define exactly what they were, and the reason is because they're complicated. Broadly speaking, there's two kinds of drugs. There's new drugs, where all the reports of safety and efficacy were conducted by the brand. Then there's generic drugs, where there's no reports of safety and efficacy. All a generic drug manufacturer has to do, in fact, all they can do is prove equivalence to the brand. To say someone else did all the clinical trials, our drug is equivalent. But what if you do a follow-on? What if you tweak a drug? What if you make some changes? In that case, it's simply called a 505(b)(2). There's other names for it. I think all those names are insufficient. And so the easiest thing to call it is a 505(b)(2). And this is one of the things which your company may be doing as the life cycle for a branded drug gets old. Some of the examples are changing a formulation or a manufacturer, so reducing the cost of manufacturing the drug. So that's a tweak to the drug. It's substantive enough that it will require a 505(b)(2) application rather than leaning on the original application. Changing the dosage form, so taking an orally dosed drug and making it available as a patch, maybe for geriatric populations, maybe making it extended release, things like that. So those are also 505(b)(2)s, and so those can also extend your life cycle. New combinations, taking existing drugs, putting them together, having greater than anticipated results through that combination. That's another example of a 505(b)(2), and these are all the sorts of things that branded companies will do to protect their brand, protect their molecules past patent expiration against generics. I mentioned authorized generics off the top, and here's the definition of that. So on the very far right of the slide, you see traditional generics. They're sold only after drug patent expiration, except in exemplary cases. And the price is typically far less than branded or authorized generics. An authorized generic is a way for brands to compete with generics while they still have 6 months of market exclusivity. So as I mentioned, if a generic company invalidates a patent and they get 6 months of generic market exclusivity for that drug, there's nothing stopping the brand from licensing a third party to sell the branded drug under a different label because it's coming off the exact same line as the branded drug. So the manufacturing is all approved by the FDA and what have you. They can authorize a third party to sell an authorized generic. So you have the brand selling one drug, the generic entrant who invalidated the patent selling another drug with 6 months of market exclusivity, and the third party licensed from the brand selling an authorized generic. And you'll find that the price is not as low as the traditional generic, but suppliers tend to prefer it because they know exactly what is in those bottles. It's the exact same thing as the branded drug. And so it'll put pricing pressure on the patent challenging generic and allow the brand to basically double dip and play both sides. The other area to look is branded generics. And so these are generic drugs which, for whatever reason, have a brand name on them. And so an example here, this is a slide just showing some authorized generics and their manufacturers. But an example here for a branded generic is Abbott selling vitamin gummy bears in, I believe this is Kazakhstan or Ukraine. And so in some countries, you might not necessarily trust the local manufacturers, but you'll certainly trust the international brands. And so when it comes to giving vitamin gummy bears to your kids, if you have the choice, if you have the wherewithal, you'd rather buy this branded generic. And so it's another strategy which can be used by large brands to compete with other generics to say, look, we have better drugs than your drugs. These are vitamin gummy bears. They're, they're the sort of thing which might have a ton of price competition, but Abbott can charge more because everyone knows and likes them. So the last thing I wanted to cover here before I close is just understanding patent claims. And this is not legal advice. I don't want to go into this too deeply, but the thing to understand is that there's many patents which might be covering a drug. And just looking at the, counting up if a drug has, like, let's say a half dozen patents on it, 6 patents, it's not necessarily the latest expiring patent or the first expiring patent, which is going to be controlling generic entry. The general pattern is the compound claiming patents. This does change depending on exactly what the context is. For a drug like epinephrine, the EpiPen, there were no compound claims on that drug. It was a device claim because the auto-injector, which contained epinephrine, was actually the thing keeping generics off the market. But generally speaking, it's compound claims which are going to keep generics off the market. So if a patent claims the active ingredient for a drug, atorvastatin, something like that, the actual synthesis and production and use of that drug, of that compound, there's no way to work around it. Without making that compound, you need to make that compound to have the drug. Once you've made that compound, if you're selling it, you're likely going to be violating infringing on a compound claim. Then there's process claims. Drugs might be difficult to manufacture, maybe expensive to manufacture. So if a company can claim the process to manufacture that drug, then they might be able to keep generics at bay unless the generics can find another way to manufacture the drug to work around those process claims. Maybe it's expensive, maybe they found a cheaper way to do it overall. And so those process claims tend to be workable, able to be worked around. So that's another set of claims to be taken a look at. And there's automated systems that can be used to pull these claims out of patents as well. But it's always wise to have skilled attorneys confirm freedom to operate. The other claims are things like formulation and dosage claims. And so if it is patentable to be changing the dosage form for a drug. One example is inhalable insulin. So insulins are always coming and going off the market. They're being reformulated, and these new formulations are really the crux of the patent landscape, because the molecule is well known. You can tweak the molecule too, but often it's just a matter of taking a orally dosed drug, putting on a patch, something else, auto-injector, like I mentioned with epinephrine, which can give you defensible claims that other companies would then have to work around. And then finally, use claims. So if a drug can be used for multiple indications, multiple diseases, generics may or may not be able to work around those use claims if there's more than one. The recent rulings suggest that they can't do what's called a skinny label, but chances are that's going to come right back around again. So not making a final determination here, but the thing to think about is if there are use claims on a drug, what Pfizer did with Viagra was they actually had separate drugs under each one of the dominant uses so that there couldn't be skinny labels made against it. And so that's one of the decisions your company may be making. And you'll have to devote resources, of course, to working on all the science to support these sorts of claims so the patents can be filed against them. And so that's it's a lot we just went over in a very short amount of time. Just one last slide here is going through the patent priority cheat sheet. So there's a bit of a waterfall effect, taking a look at first extended patents, because the party who owns the patent would likely elect to extend the most valuable ones. Litigated patents is the flip side of a market-based learning is if generics are challenging a patent, chances are it's an important patent. They're not going to waste their money. So if you're just blindly looking at which patent might be controlling generic entry, you look at extended patents, you look at litigated patents. If there's nothing left, you look at compound claiming patents. And if there's nothing left and there's no generics on the market, you look for unexpired patents, and that'll give you a rough prediction of when generics may enter. As I said, we went over a lot of material very, very quickly here. A lot of it is, I think, adjacent to the work you do, but it's important to have the strategic underpinnings. And I'm happy to offer this book for free. I'll send you an ebook. Just drop me an email, and I'll shoot you off a copy. Thank you for your time, and I'm happy to take any questions.